Professor Ian Buruma, distinguished guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to welcome you here today to the NUS Public Symposium, Competition and Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, Recognizing Challenges and Seizing Opportunities. I'm Yoko Nakano, Assistant Professor in the Department of Japanese Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, National University of Singapore. I'm also the project lead of Regional Architecture and Framework for Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. Today, Asia is facing many challenges: long-standing territorial disputes, maritime security, a potential for economic and financial breakdown, environmental degradation, and human rights violation. With rising tensions in East Asia, how can we engage with those collective action problems? What is a way to overcome differences and mistrust and to work together for the people living in this region? I hope this symposium will give an opportunity to reflect and think about where we are now and where we are going in the 21st century. On behalf of my project team, Dr. Ian Chon and Dr. Soo-Yeon Kim in the Department of Political Science, I would like to express my gratitude to the distinguished speakers who agreed to come here today. Especially, we are honored by the presence of Professor Ian Buruma, who came all the way from the cold New York City. Thank you very much for coming and welcome to Singapore. We are also honored to other guest speakers who agreed to come here today. All of them are distinguished guest speakers and specialists in international relations. I am sure they will give us scholarly insight into the contentious and sometimes emotional issues in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, I would like to hand over to Professor Hendrik Meyer-Orr, the head of the Department of Japanese Studies. Thank you, and I hope you will enjoy the symposium.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to join this major event on the subject of Asia-Pacific regional cooperation. I think with all the events and everything that's happening in the region at the moment, this is a very important event. My name is Hendrik Meyer-Orr and I'm the head of the Department of Japanese Studies. The Department of Japanese Studies was established in 1981. I think this has some relationship with the Fukuda Doctrine of 1978, which might be talked about a little bit today. Since the establishment, the department has been active in building a better understanding of Japan inside and outside of the National University of Singapore. Our department represents a diversity of topics, and these range from culture, arts, history, geography, business, society, and of course politics and international relations. So each faculty member represents their own field, but of course we also try to work together, and today's event is certainly the outcome of the diversity that the Department of Japanese Studies represents. I hope that everyone will learn from today's meeting. I would sincerely like to welcome all our guest speakers and thank them for coming here. I would also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Nakano, and all colleagues from the Political Science Department for organizing this event. And basically, I'm standing between you and great speakers today, so I shouldn't talk too much. So I wish you a very interesting afternoon. I wish us very nice and good discussions, and I very much look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Ted Huff from the Department of Political Science at NUS. I'm a professor of international relations theory. And I guess what I'm really representing here today is Soo-Yeon Kim and Ian Chong, who are the two political science representatives on the symposium organizing committee. I'd like to thank them for giving us this opportunity. And of course, welcome all of you to Singapore and to this conference, which of course is timely. It would be nice to think that this would be like one of the last such symposium we need to have. I suspect this is going to go on for decades. So we'll be meeting very, very frequently I'm afraid. But I'm even closer to standing between you and the speakers, so let me now welcome Sino-Japanese and Ian Buruma to the podium and get started. Thanks.
Hi, welcome. One more welcome. I'm Professor Dwara. I'm just going to moderate this session. I'm from the Asia Research Institute, Director of the Asia Research Institute. And although you have Professor Buruma's introduction in the flyer that you all have, let me just reinforce some of his achievements. Professor Ian Buruma is the Henry Luce Professor of Democracy, Human Rights, and Journalism at Bard College in New York State, very close to New York City, I believe. And he is, as you see here, one of the world's leading public intellectuals on Asia. And he has received many prizes and has written many books. Professor Buruma was educated in both the Netherlands and Japan, and I think he began his studies in Japanese studies, didn't you? Chinese studies, oh, better still. So, but that is often a step. So he has a step taken from Chinese studies into Japan and Japanese studies into China that several people did 20 years ago. And so we're very pleased to have his insights on the two societies. So I give you, Professor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to come to Singapore again for the first time in 14 years. So I'm grateful for that, and it's an honor to be here. Now, China and Japan, and a little bit South Korea will be the topic of my talk. We've all seen the famous photograph last week of the Japanese Prime Minister and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping shaking hands and making it very clear to the world that neither of them wanted to do so. Now this was reported in the newspapers yesterday in the Straits Times, I saw, as a breakthrough. I'm not so sure. I think if they'd refused to shake hands, that really would have sent a signal to the world, which wouldn't have been a very good signal, but it would have been a signal. Well, they made it quite clear what the nature of the occasion was. Ostensibly, the tensions in East Asia are about territory, about the islands. Most of us will know what that means. The Diaoyu, or the Senkaku, and in the case of Korea and Japan, the Dokdo or the Takeshima Islands. Now, all these islands were taken by Japan in an imperialist period after the Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War. And claims are being made, of course, by the Koreans and the Chinese that they always belonged to them. Now, they were always, what belonging means, of course, is a fraught issue. International law doesn't really cover it. These are historical issues which are vague and very hard to deal with purely in terms of the law. Now, the real reason, I think, for these disputes is not really because the islands have strategic importance or possibly oil. That certainly helps make these disputes important, but the real issue underlying it all is the attempt by China, which presumably will be successful, to become the dominant regional power again. That's really underlying it, and the anxiety in the periphery in Japan as well as in Southeast Asia about the consequences of this new dominance. That's really what's being fought out here, I think symbolically, in the case of the islands. Japan, of course, is anxious to balance China in some way or to stop being a vassal state or a tribute state in traditional terms, which it never was really. And the Koreans are playing a more traditional game of recognizing the power of China and making sure that they are sort of protected in one way or another. Now, what we're told often by analysts in the press and in academia and political speeches too, is that what really underlies these tensions in East Asia are the wounds of history, the unhealed wounds of World War II, the emotions which are still running high amongst the victims, the danger of resurgent Japanese nationalism, the unresolved questions of history in Japan, and so forth. And there is some plausibility to that claim. After all, the South Korean President Park Geun-hye refuses to speak even to the Japanese Prime Minister because of the official Japanese attitude, the official government attitude, and people close to the government about the so-called comfort women. The Chinese are quick to point out the dangers of the Japanese militarist survival every time a Japanese cabinet minister, and certainly if the Prime Minister himself, pays a visit to Yasukuni Shrine, where the souls of those who have died for the imperial cause since the Meiji Restoration are worshipped. It's sometimes misunderstood. It's not a shrine to commemorate soldiers in the Imperial Army of World War II per se. It's there for the souls of those who have fought on the side of the Emperor for much longer than World War II. That includes certain people who were indicted as Class A war criminals. Now, the question I'd like to pose is how true it is that these historical traumas, these emotions about history, these unhealed wounds, are truly the reason for the conflicts that are being fought out today. I'm slightly skeptical about that. After all, the emotions of hostility towards Japan to do with World War II, to do with the Nanjing Massacre, for example, or the comfort women, they do tend to ebb and flow according to political circumstances. And the same is true of expressions of Japanese nationalism and attitudes towards World War II. Now, that many people clearly are emotional about these issues is of course true. That a lot of the wounds inflicted by Japan in its militarist days from the 1930s onwards till 1945 that were serious and cannot simply be dismissed is also true. So the emotional side of it I don't want to downplay at all. But I think, as is true of so many of these things, if you look at history, when hostility or hostile feelings, or as the Chinese government likes to put it, the feelings of the Chinese people and so on, when they are vented in collectively, it's almost always due to some kind of political manipulation. They're done for political reasons, and they're not spontaneous outbursts of emotion, as they're often described. If you take the territorial disputes, for example, or indeed the conflicts about wartime history, they weren't always on the political agenda. If you look at the history of Chinese post-war Chinese quarrels with Japan, the Diaoyu Islands, or the Diaoyu Islands, were not really on the agenda ever. When Mao Zedong was in power, they were not really mentioned at all. The aim of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao was to consolidate its own power, the power of the Communist Party in China, and it let these kind of conflicts over territory and so on, let it be. Hong Kong was allowed to go on, as it always was, as a British colonial possession, because Mao wasn't really interested in opening up conflicts over those kind of things. The same was true when Chiang Kai-shek was ruled Taiwan. These historical issues were not really brought up at the time. other things, more pragmatic things, took their place. Even under Deng Xiaoping, the question of the islands with Japan was shelved. He famously said we should leave this issue until sometime in the future when people can find the wisdom to deal with them. But we don't need to deal with them right now. Now, even something as symbolically fraught and as heated as the history of the Nanjing massacre was not always an issue between China and Japan, or Taiwan and Japan. Nanjing was of very little interest what happened there in 1937, which was clearly an act of tremendous barbarism in World War II, which should never be forgotten. Tens of thousands, or perhaps hundreds of thousands of people were murdered, raped, and so on. One can't get away from that. This should be an unforgettable example of wartime barbarism perpetrated by the Japanese. But it was not of great interest to the Communist Party under Mao. It was the nationalist capital. It was under the Kuomintang in 1937. There was no heroic story that could bolster the prestige of the Communist Party. So it was fairly useless as a tool of propaganda for the Communist Party in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. When Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue in 1972 visited China to resume normal relations between the two countries, normal between quotation marks, he was so secure in his nationalist credentials that he could even crack a joke which would be almost impossible to imagine being cracked by a current Chinese leader. And the joke that many of you probably know, is that when Tanaka met Mao, Tanaka then expressed his apologies for what Japan had done to China in the 1930s and early 40s, and Mao smiled and says there's absolutely no need to apologize. Without the Japanese invasion, the Chinese Communist Party would not be in power. Which was an accurate historical analysis on the part of Mao, but you cannot imagine Xi Jinping saying something like that, let alone Hu Jintao. So it was really only after Mao died, I think, that things began to change in the direction that we see today, that history became a contentious issue. The monopoly on power of the Chinese Communist Party after Mao could no longer really be justified by reference to Marxism, Leninism, or Mao Zedong thought. They'd been fairly badly discredited because of the blood-soaked history of Maoism in China itself. Something else had to be found instead. Also, when Deng Xiaoping, as the paramount leader of China, decided that the Chinese economy could only be revived and China could only become more prosperous by opening up China to business with the capitalist world, he also knew this could make him vulnerable to those who might accuse him of being soft on foreigners, and specifically soft on Japan. It's only then, really, that communist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, was gradually being replaced, quite deliberately and consciously, of course, with a new ideology to justify the monopoly on power of the Chinese Communist Party, and that was a modern form of Chinese nationalism. And that's why, and it's usually called patriotic education. And the idea under Deng Xiaoping was that China would emerge, re-emerge, as a great power, as a prosperous, rich and powerful country, and would never be humiliated by foreign powers again. The gist of patriotic education that you see all over China now is that in the last 150 years, the history of this kind of patriotism usually doesn't go back much further than that. China was humiliated by foreign powers, beginning with the Opium War, and then, of course, by the Japanese. And this would never happen again. But the only guarantee that this would never happen again would be the continued rule of the Communist Party in China. Only that would create the stability and wealth and power that would allow China to re-emerge without being encroached on by foreigners. This idea of humiliation, of nationalism based on humiliation, as we've seen in other countries and in other periods, is a very risky one, because it can lead, or does lead, to feelings of revanchism. It's not a very positive form of nationalism. It's not a form of patriotism based on pride in past achievements. It's a kind of patriotism based on the sense of grievance, of having been humiliated and never allowing it to happen again. China is often compared to Wilhelminian Germany, late 19th, early 20th century Germany in that respect, and the comparison is doesn't entirely fit in many ways, but in the sense of its modern nationalist rhetoric, I think the comparison is useful, because early 20th century, late 19th century Germany had that same sense that it was being encircled by hostile powers and that didn't want Germany to have its time, its place in the sun, as the phrase went in those days, didn't want it to emerge as a great power. And I think Chinese nationalism is playing very much along those same lines. So it was for that reason that the Chinese government in 1982 suddenly started a whole new form of rhetoric to do with history textbooks in Japan, to do with Nanjing, and so on. When it was erroneously reported in the Chinese press, the Asahi Shimbun, I believe it was, that Japanese textbooks had all been revised to change the word invasion of China to advance into China, and that all references to the Nanjing massacre had been deleted. And as I said, this was actually not true, but it was reported. This was immediately taken up by the Chinese government as a major issue. And it was because Deng needed to show that he was a proper nationalist, that he would not be soft on Japan. It also was the first time that the Nanjing massacre really became a big issue. It was in 1985 that the big museum was built in Nanjing with the famous 300,000 victims of the massacre. Whether it was really 300,000, we'll never really know. Some historians say yes, others dispute it and say it was fewer in number. Nonetheless, that's become the official slogan. And this museum in Nanjing became a model for similar museums all over China. There's a museum in Shenyang commemorating the annexation of Manchuria or Manchukuo in 1931. There are museums to the Opium Wars and so on. And all of them basically have the same message, which is we will never be humiliated again. Look what happened to China when our government was weak. The Chinese Communist Party will make sure that this will never happen again. That is the message in all these museums, monuments, commemorations, textbooks, and so on. That's the idea with which young Chinese are educated and grow up. The problem with this line is that it's a fairly risky one, because as modern history also shows, the Chinese government itself is vulnerable to those kind of feelings of nationalism. Everybody here will know about the May 4th movement in 1919. Now, the May 4th movement began as a protest movement against the Chinese government giving too much away to Japan, in fact, in 1919 during the Versailles Conference that ended after the end of World War I. And so the Chinese government has to be very careful when it stirs up these emotions against Japan, specifically in this case, because it can very quickly turn against the Chinese government itself as a protest against the rulers of China not being tough enough on foreigners. So when it stirs things up, it looks as though it could run out of control. It very quickly has to put it back in its box again. This is as far as Chinese attitudes to Japan are concerned, which, as I argued, are largely domestic and cannot really be simply explained by the unhealed wounds of history. Now, as far as the Japanese attitudes to China, there are signs in Tokyo today that China is becoming a bit of an obsession. If you go to an average Japanese bookstore, you'll see piles of books now, all to do with China. The rise of China, the triumph of China, the danger of China, the downfall of China. China, 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 as the former Japanese diplomat said, describing the focus of foreign policy in Japan today. He said this rather recently. The weekly magazines are filled with stories along similar lines. And I think Prime Minister Abe is probably entirely sincere that he wants to improve relations with China. Every Japanese Prime Minister wants to improve relations with China. But he's going about it in a very peculiar way. Because he's surrounded himself by people who do everything to irritate the Chinese and help Chinese nationalist propagandists make their case more persuasive. You see it in the language. People who support Abe's views on history tend not to talk about chumoku, which is the standard Japanese word for China. They talk about shina, which is the old imperialist phrase for China, used in the 1930s and 1940s. This is not done innocently. It's a completely deliberate use of language, which is not designed to irritate the Chinese, of course, but it's done to express a particular view. The visits to the Yasukuni Shrine are the same thing. One of Abe's cronies, who was appointed to be on the board of NHK, often mislabeled as the BBC in Japan. It's certainly the national broadcasting company, but certainly much less independent from the government than the BBC is. He said the comfort women was an entirely normal phenomenon in every country during war as brothels. There was absolutely nothing to apologize for, and in any case they were all paid prostitutes and so on. Nothing is more designed to inflame passions in Korea and other places than to say such things. Now, one reason for this kind of rhetoric is certainly Japan's justified worry about the rise of China and the dominance of China, which will put a lot of pressure on Japan to basically comply with everything the Chinese want. Japanese leaders, and here's there's a parallel, I think, between Japanese leaders and the predicament of Chinese leaders, especially if they're conservatives. They cannot be seen by their own supporters and followers to be soft on China, so they have to crank up the rhetoric, perhaps more than they are trying to do anyway, and certainly more than they should do if they want better relations with China. But again, I think that doesn't explain the whole thing, or it doesn't explain it adequately. Like in China, I think domestic politics are really are the real reason for a lot of the nationalist rhetoric that we see coming from Japan today, because they're not really, when Abe and his friends in NHK and other places are saying these things about the wartime past and about China and so on, they're not really aiming these remarks or opinions at the Chinese public or even at the Chinese rulers, let alone Koreans. These are domestic things that are being fought out here. And the people that they're really aiming them at are fellow Japanese. It's not the Chinese they're trying to oppose, it's what is left in Japan of the left-wing liberals, which is, like everywhere else, a shrinking minority, but they're still there, and conservatives are really getting at them when they're reviving these history issues. They're getting at, specifically in media terms, at the Asahi Shimbun, which is always associated with the liberal, as the sort of voice of the liberal left in Japan. And so the targets of the hostility of the new nationalists in Japan are not the Chinese or the Koreans. They're the Asahi Shimbun readers in Japan itself. what they're opposing is what conservative nationalists in Japan call the Tokyo Trials view of history. The view, namely, that was held by the judges of the victorious powers in 1945 and 1946, that Japan had fought a barbarous war, analogous to the one fought by Germany in Europe, and Japan should atone for its past sins, and therefore it was important to not only judge the Japanese leaders who were responsible for these war crimes during the war, but Japan something should be done to make sure Japan would never rise as a great military and hostile militarist power again. Now, what Abe and the nationalists want is to revise this Tokyo Trials view of history and instill a new kind of patriotic pride amongst the younger generation in Japan. Exercise history textbooks from those things which might make them feel less proud of Japan, such as a focus on war crimes in World War II. Do away with the whole view of the war as it was promoted by the Allies after the war and by the Japanese left. Now, why is this? What is at the basis of this particular exercise? And again, to understand that, we have to go back to 1945. In both Germany and Japan, the Allies were faced with the problem of how they were going to make sure that the defeated powers that would have unleashed the war in the 30s and 40s would never do so again. Now, the analysis in the case of Germany was simpler than it was the case of Japan. In the case of Germany was a civilized European nation, and the government had been taken over by a criminal regime in 1933 by Hitler and the Nazi Party. So the analysis went in 1945, if you can purge Germany of the Nazis and the Nazi ideology, you get rid of the Nazi leaders, Germany can very easily be turned back into a civilized European nation, a liberal democracy, and bad things wouldn't happen again as a consequence. Now I'm talking about West Germany, of course, here. East Germany was a different matter, since it was not, it was in the Soviet bloc. In the Japanese case, it was more complicated, because who do you blame for the militarism of the 1930s and 40s? There was no equivalent of the Nazi Party. There was no Hitler, even though in wartime propaganda, General Tojo was often cartooned as though he were a Hitler, but he really wasn't. He had nothing like the power of Hitler, or the charisma. So there was no clear parallel, even though people sought to make these parallels in 1945, but they were wrong historically. So something else had to be blamed for the reason why Japan went so badly wrong. What ended up being blamed, in a sense, was Japanese culture itself. It was the Bushido, the warrior tradition, the cult of the emperor, as though this was a very deep and ancient and embedded Japanese tradition. Japan itself, the whole culture, really had to be transformed in order to make sure Japan would never go to war again. And because the military got the blame, militarism got the blame, Japan could not be, unlike Germany, could not be given the responsibility ever again to wage war with armed force. And so while Germany became a member of NATO with its own West Germany, with its own armed forces, which by the way was not something many Germans wanted at the time, but it was fairly easily done. Instead of that, Japan, there was of course no East Asian equivalent of NATO either, which is very important. But Japan was given a pacifist constitution, the famous Article 9, written by Americans, that made it unconstitutional for Japan to have its own armed forces and to use armed force as a tool of foreign policy. Most Japanese at the time, and most Japanese still, had no problem with this at all. They were very sick of war. They were sick of being bossed around by their own soldiers. And they were happy to turn a new page, and even took some moral satisfaction in being a pacifist nation that would be a kind of beacon of moral probity to the rest of the world. The Japanese conservative elite was also not unhappy with constitutional pacifism, because it allowed what part of the deal was that the US would be responsible for Japanese security, and the Japanese could get on with doing business, which suited the business elite fine. The liberal left in Japan defended the constitutional pacifism by echoing the Allied view, the Tokyo Trial view, that Japan had to make amends for its barbarous war and should never go to war again. Now, there was one minority that since the end of World War II was very much opposed to all this. And it was a nationalist right-wing element in Japanese conservative politics, who resented this American pacifist constitution because they felt, quite rightly, in fact, although they said it for reasons one might very much disagree, but they felt that this was robbing Japan of an essential part of its sovereignty, namely to be able to decide itself on matters of war and peace. It also saw the Tokyo Trial's view of history and the pacifist constitution as an attack on what they saw as traditional Japanese identity, traditional sense of Japanese morals and so on, which was very much associated with the cult of the emperor and everything associated with it. Now, one of the main figures in this was Abe's grandfather, Kishimoto Nobusuke, who tried to revise the pacifist constitution. Not because he was hostile to the US. In fact, he played golf with General Eisenhower. He was a friend of Nixon's. He was a fellow Cold Warrior, and so was very much pro-American in that sense. But he wanted Japan to have more equal status. Now, he failed to get 2/3 of the Japanese Diet to support the revision of the pacifist constitution. So instead, what he did was to argue for a more equitable security treaty with the United States, one that gave Japan a little bit more face, a little bit more better status in the post-war agreement. Now, he did that by ramming through the new security treaty with the US in 1960 with massive demonstrations going on against it. There was so much opposition to it that he literally had to sort of lock up the opposition to the new treaty in the Diet while ramming it through during the night. Now, he got his treaty, but he lost his job, even if he didn't lose his influence in the Japanese Conservative Liberal Democratic Party. But what it did, since conservatives couldn't get 2/3 of the Diet to support its constitutional revision, what it did, and the effect we can still see today, is that those who argued for constitutional revision very rarely do it on purely political grounds, which is the way it should be argued. What's happened instead is that a discussion on history has replaced a discussion on politics. What I mean by that is that as long as the liberal left defend pacifism in Japan by stressing Japanese war crimes, atrocities, the Nanjing massacre, and so on, the more the conservatives who want to revise the constitution have to argue that this is completely wrong. These war crimes are a lie, they're a figment of propaganda, of Chinese propaganda, Japanese leftists, the Asahi Shimbun, and so on and so forth. So what's happened in Japan, unlike in Germany, is that a political discussion has become a historical discussion. History has become politicized in a way that hasn't happened in Europe, that is still souring relations between Japan and its neighbors. In short, the conflicts about Yasukuni Shrine, about comfort with it and so on, are really a result of that. They're a domestic political conflict which is causing conflict with China and Korea. Now to South Korea, which is a more complicated case, but just as much to do with the recent past. When Japan had annexed Korea as part of the Japanese Empire, a large number of the Korean elite collaborated with the Japanese colonial authorities. Now, this is still a very, very difficult subject in South Korea and fraught with controversy. But some Koreans in the elite did it for sheer opportunism, some out of fear, and some because they genuinely believed that Japanese colonial rule was the best way to modernize Korea. They built universities, railroads, and so all the kind of thing that colonial empires often do rather well, even though they do it very brutally and in a humiliating way to the colonial people. I don't have to explain that here in Singapore. Now, opposition to Japanese rule in Korea largely came from the left. And for a brief moment, in 1945, after Japanese defeat, it looked as though the nationalist left in Korea, both in the north and the south, would come to power, would be able to rule Korea after the war. Now, as soon as the Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung as the leader in North Korea, this came to nothing, because the Americans who were administering the South at the time, who had never trusted the left-wing Koreans anyway, supported the Cold Warriors, people who were against the anti-communists, and they happened to be largely to coincide with the elites that had collaborated with the Japanese during the colonial period. The leading figure of this, just as Abe's grandfather was a leading figure in the Cold War in Japan, Park Chung-hye's father, Park Chung-hee, was of course the leading figure of this. He came to power in a military coup in 1961, became president in 1963, resumed normal relations with Japan in 1965, was paid reparations by the Japanese government for what had happened during the colonial period and so on. And as far as Park was concerned, he wanted, that took care of history, bygones would be bygones, history would no longer be an issue in the relations between Japan and Korea. Inside Korea, however, history was not forgotten, and opposition to military dictatorships, first under Park Chung-hee and later under others, largely came from the old left, the same left that had opposed the Korean elite in the Japanese period, and even before that. Kim Dae-jung, for example, came from Cholla, a province which was largely rural and that had been rebellious against the Korean Yanban, the elite, the gentry, for centuries. And precisely, the Yanban was precisely the gentry elite from which Park Chung-hee, the Park family, came. And when Roh Moo-hyun, a former student activist and civil rights lawyer, became president in 2003, he went after the old elite, this old elite, by opening up investigations in the history of collaboration with the Japanese. Now, this was, of course, an entirely political act. It was a populist left-wing act against the old elite. What that means is that hostility to Japan in Korea goes hand in hand with hostility against the old conservative elite. So it's a domestic political issue that's played out in an international way. And Park Chung-hye has to do everything to distance herself from her father's legacy in order to not to be vulnerable to nationalists. And her father's legacy, by the way, goes deep in Japan, because his Japanese name during the colonial period was Takagi Masao. He was an officer in the Manchukuo army at the same time that Kishi was the industrial czar in Manchukuo, and in charge of slave labor programs and that kind of thing. And so Park Chung-hee was deeply tainted by the Japanese past. His daughter has to do everything to make sure that she's not tainted by the same thing. And that is why, even though her own inclination may be to have good relations with Japan, she has to distance herself from this for domestic reasons in South Korea. Now, I think, and I'll conclude with a few remarks on that. The role of the United States has to be brought into all this as well, because without that, we can't really understand the tensions in East Asia. The security arrangements made in the late 1940s and 1950s were roughly analogous to what happened in Europe after World War II. If the policy of the US and NATO in Europe was to keep the Soviets out and the Germans down, the same sort of policy pertained to East Asia, which was to keep the Chinese out and Japan down. That was partly the background of the US-Japan security treaty. This was part of the Cold War. It made a certain kind of logical sense, and so on. Now, whether the Cold War is really over in East Asia is, of course, a moot point. It's certainly not over in the same sense that it's over, well, with Putin's Russia. I'm not sure it's entirely over in Europe either. It looked as though it was over for a while. But in Japan, nonetheless, even though it may not be quite over, circumstances have changed considerably since 1945. And it might be asked whether the arrangements locked into place in the 1950s, with Japan as a completely dependent state of the United States for its security, the idea of keeping Japan down and China out. The question is whether these arrangements haven't really become a bit obsolete. Isn't it time for Japan to play a more sovereign role, become less of a vassal state to the US? And if this order can go on still for a long time, as long as the United States is prepared to be the policeman of East Asia, as long as US taxpayers are prepared to support this, as long as America wants to be or can be a world policeman. But in the very long run, or perhaps not even so very long, I think it would help everybody if Asian countries could come to their own arrangements, their own accommodations, without the US having to be the policeman in East Asia. Now, for that to happen, the constitution in Japan would have to be revised. For Japan to regain sovereignty, it would have to be revised. That doesn't necessarily mean that revising the constitution in Japan would be that Japan would become a new militarist power again. It simply would mean it would have the sovereignty, like other countries, to make its own decisions on questions of war and peace. Now, I don't see how a figure like Abe could do this. You can't really convince not only Japanese citizens, but Japan's neighbors that it would be a good thing to trust Japan with armed force again if you start talking about World War II having been the righteous war of Asian liberation, if you worship the souls of war criminals at a nationalistic shrine, and so on and so forth. Ideally, it would have to be done by a Japanese government that is seen by everybody to be liberal, democratic in the true sense, not quite in the sense of the party's name currently ruling Japan, and which is also entirely open to look at Japan's past honestly, even at its darkest pages. And for a while, it looked as though the government had, for the first time since the end of the war, taken power, had broken the monopoly on power of the Liberal Democrats, the Democratic Party of Japan. It looked as though they were moving in this direction a little bit. Under Hatoyama and others, there was an attempt to find a new accommodation with Japan's eastern neighbors, with China specifically. There was an attempt, at least rhetorically, to be more independent from the United States. It failed. And it failed because the Prime Minister at the time, Hatoyama, another scion of an old Japanese political family that goes way back into World War II before, was ham-fisted, he was clumsy. It failed because the Chinese didn't cooperate with this. It failed because the US didn't really like to see a challenge to the status quo. And so we're back to the status quo of the 1950s. And even the Chinese may be happier with this. But again, I think the Chinese policy is highly contradictory, because on the one hand, they're trying to drive a wedge between the US and its Japanese ally. It rhetorically would like the US to clear out of the region and no longer be the regional policeman. On the other hand, if the US were ready to relinquish that role, it would almost certainly mean that voices in Japan to revive military power and possibly become a nuclear power would grow. And given the choice between Pax Americana and a revived Japan as a nuclear power, I think most Chinese would prefer the former. Now, the US never was a formal empire, formally speaking. But it's faced, I think, with a familiar late imperial dilemma, which is that if you've locked into place certain imperial arrangements, certain dependencies on the imperial power, it's very difficult to change that, to undo those arrangements without creating great disorder. You saw this at the end of the British Raj in India, when in 1947, when British withdrawal immediately led to massive bloodshed during partition. And the argument usually made in favor of empire in late imperial periods is that if we cannot leave now because the colonial people are not yet ready for it, they can't rule themselves, we have to stay here because otherwise there'll be chaos and mayhem and so on. It's always the argument of late empire. The problem with it is that as long as the empire stays in place, the colonial people will never be ready for ruling themselves. The empire has to retreat for people to be able to do it. Now, this often is a messy and chaotic process, but it's something that has to be done. Now, I think this is the problem now faced by the US and its Asian allies, that if the US were to leave or to relinquish its role as the policeman of East Asia, it probably would lead to chaos and hostility and possibly war. But the longer they stay, the harder they make it for the Japanese and the Chinese to come to some kind of equitable and, in the long run, peaceful accommodation themselves. And on that happy note, I will ask the question.
We have mics for question and answer. Thank you very much, Professor Buruma, for a very exhaustive analysis and interesting analysis of the situation in East Asia. It is customary for the chair or moderator to make a few comments, so I will just make a few observations and have a question before we open it up, and you can answer whenever you want. I have just to reinforce some of the points that Professor Buruma was taking up about how the competition and nationalism is very much an internally developed, has an internal constituency and basis, although of course they get locked into a certain relationship, is that I had when was it? I think it was in 2005 or six, just after the Shanghai anti-Japanese riots. I think that was 2005. There was a group of historians in Shanghai, in the Wadong Shiban Dashi, which is the East China Normal University, who decided that they would write some textbooks with which they could educate high school students in Shanghai, because they didn't want Shanghai to be raising highly nationalist children that were oblivious to the role of Shanghai as a global city and a cosmopolitan global city, upon which its reputation, particularly in economic matters, depended. And so they wrote these textbooks, including some friends of mine, Xu Jilin and others, that dropped any mention in the high school textbooks, first of Mao Zedong, second of the Nanjing massacre, and other related kinds of issues. For 1 year, the municipality of Shanghai used those books. But then there was actually, it was more than anything else, it was the blogosphere that actually began to say that now Shanghai women will start taking Japanese names and Shanghai men would start marrying Japanese women, and so that was put to an end, right? I think what I want to say here is that basically the economic relations, there's a contrast here between the economic and the geopolitical relations. There is a tremendous desire, certainly in certain parts of the Chinese system, for economic relations to grow. Right now, as we know, if you combine the total production of China, Japan, and Korea, it is going to be bigger than US and, or if it is not already, it is soon going to be bigger than US and Europe combined. But trade among them is a much smaller portion, although it's still very big. Somebody did an analysis to show that it could grow by 366% if geopolitical differences did not keep them divided and prevent this kind of thing. So I think we have very much, there are good reasons to promote, and there are other good reasons also, of course, particularly now that we live in the Anthropocene, for environmental concerns that are being produced collectively, but to the extent that they're being addressed, they're addressed singly, and other such things. So it is a very, I think, important issue that we need to look at, how and why these geopolitical issues are getting in the way. I have one question for, or maybe a comment type question, I'm sure you would want to respond, to your whole narrative about why it was, especially if we compare Japan with Germany, which is of course a narrative that has been developed quite extensively in many different circles. And there's a wonderful study by Sebastian Conrad on lost empires or losing empires or something. But one of the issues is that my question is, and you did address it, why the Germans did not develop the same kind of nationalistic structure that the Japanese ultimately did. And it had something to do with the Cold War, I think. Because as you know very well, the Japanese, the SCAP, or the occupation regime in Japan, retreated from the reforms. So that in many parts, including the education ministry and so on, you had the continued legacy of extreme Japanese nationalists, many of whom were restored at that point as well. So I wonder if that doesn't have a role in this continuing tension that takes place in Japan in a way that it doesn't to the same extent in Germany. But at any rate, these are some of my questions, and as I said, you can sort of address them in the course of your answers to others. But the floor is now open for other comments and discussion. Yes, sir, please identify yourself and keep your questions short.
I'm Alan Pollard, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. Actually, I've just come back from Beijing APEC meetings where I've observed a lot of that very awkward body language that you talked about. But at the same time, we saw a whole series of economic understandings, cooperation, dialogue going on. And Professor Buruma, you didn't really talk very much about the role of economic integration in all of this. These economies are really tied together quite closely in many ways. What difference do you think that's making?
Well, I'll take these two questions since you asked a similar question just now. First of all, on economic integration, that is undoubtedly true, and it's desirable. But people forget, of course, that in 1914, no continent was economically as integrated as Europe. And so, even though, so it's not a guarantee for peace. These things can unravel awfully quickly. The US had economic relations with Nazi Germany until the very last minute. Henry Ford was probably perfectly happy with this. But so the idea that because there is a lot of business between countries, or young people travel, or there are cultural exchanges, and all those other good things which we're told will prevent war, political circumstances can very quickly make those things irrelevant. So it doesn't make me as optimistic as one perhaps should be. On the difference between Japan and Germany, first of all, I think the differences are exaggerated. Yes, the old wartime elite in Japan, Kishi, who was, I just mentioned, who was not indicted, but he was arrested as a Class A war criminal. He was the kind of Albert Speer of Japan, really, during the war. That he could become prime minister would be very difficult to imagine in Germany. But that is true. But in Germany, too, the elite in Germany, the foreign ministry, the universities, the bureaucracy, and so on, was full of old Nazis. And for the same reason, that yes, in the Cold War made this reason more pressing, but it was seen as necessary for both these countries to get back on their feet as quickly as possible. You couldn't do it by destroying and purging the whole old elite. We've seen in Iraq what happens when you try to do such a thing. So it happened in both countries, really. I think the main difference is that in Germany there's pretty much a unanimity, except for a lunatic fringe, that Hitler was bad news, that the Third Reich was something that post-war Germany should distance itself from as quickly as possible. It took time in Germany too, by the way. If you look at the late 1950s, there are more Japanese films and books and novels and so on that deal honestly with World War II than was the case in Germany. In Germany, it really only began in the 1960s that people developed a really critical spirit. But the difference is that there was this unanimity in Germany. In Japan, there was never that unanimity, because there was no Hitler, there was no Third Reich. It was, in one sense, an imperial war against other empires. And so there was always a significant minority in Japan that felt that there was nothing to apologize for. And then that got politicized, and we're still living with the consequences.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Tan Kim Sui, ex-War College Singapore teacher. I address to you, Mr. Buruma, right? America fight the first broadside against China last year. The pivot, saying to China, I'm containing you, I'm watching you, don't get out. But Xi Jinping, all the Chinese and not Chinese. Their fight is time. If you want to fight that way, I have a solution. I'm not telling the world. Right now, Xi Jinping is very diplomatic. Okay. First is unfinished war. I'll continue the war. I support the whole of China. I know that because I went to China 15 years ago. I don't speak Chinese, don't speak Chinese. I found there's so much hatred of the Chinese versus Japanese. The whole of East Coast. They were talking about the whole thing. These were not first generation. These were younger Chinese. You pass on by oral literature. First generation, second generation, the third generation, go on. You remember. It's an unfinished war. The easiest target for the Chinese is Japan. Well, Chinese now have got one aircraft carrier. You just landed a plane, one aircraft carrier, which Japan had done in the 1930s. Japan was very good in the war. Aircraft carriers with the planes and so on. The planes were better than the Americans. And the Americans defeated the Japanese in midway by luck in 5 minutes. So you're going to build up a huge blue water navy. America is broke. And America will not send its boys to die in any war anymore. Obama said, come back. And America didn't win any war. in South Asia or Asia for quite a few years. Lost in Korea, lost in Vietnam, invaded Afghanistan. One is a storm, make a mess of Iraq. So I think, as far as I know, and Hillary Clinton says, all Pacific is a lot of room for all of us. Because America is using soft diplomacy in the Pacific, and China is using it. And I believe the Chinese will win the soft diplomacy. You tell the small nations in the Pacific, well, how do you develop it? You want to sign deal? Yeah, you come to vision. That kind of thing. So,
the Beijingers are going to the US.
Pardon?
The Beijingers are going to the US.
Yes, but many third world country people have been going to China for years and years and years. Many Africans have been going to China since the 90s. China gives more scholarships.
So anyway, your question.
My question is that you need to address the external relations in America and China in the future, and the pivot, which is very, very important. America has put some troops in Australia, but China has very values Australia. So, whatever the Americans do, the Chinese will do it in any field. Nuclear, you name it. They got a new aircraft carrier, they got a new plane. Americans say they copy cybercrime. So, where's the future of America? You know, Pax America? Will you be Pax America? The pivot? Can the pivot really operate? Can the pivot, my question, can the pivot really operate?
You finally got it. Okay, thank you.
No, that's how I see it.
Well, but if the question is how long will Pax Americana continue, my only answer would be I have no idea. And if it's the pivot that is the issue, I'm not entirely clear what the pivot is, and I'm not sure it's entirely clear in the minds of the American government, because on the one hand they say, well, this has nothing to do with hostility to China. We want to be friends with China. On the other hand, then why pivot? Because it's clearly is also to find some balance with India and Japan and other allies against China. So it's in many ways it is an attempt to continue Pax Americana, and I share your skepticism that this is in the long run a stable solution. In the short run, it's probably the only solution. But then again, that's the late imperial dilemma.
My name is Renee.
Excuse me, I think you've had a lot of time, so please sit down. We will now collect 3 questions at a time. So I see the lady back there has been raising her hand for a long time. Who will begin?
My name is Renee from Travel Business Analyst. Thank you, Professor Buruma, for a very insightful presentation. My question tags further on to your statement when you said Japan perhaps can be less of a vassal state of the U.S. Highlighting the current conflicts in the region where China is laying claims to all these islands in the South China Sea, and these conflicts remain unresolved. Do you have a practical solution or a practical suggestion how to resolve these conflicts, as some countries have brought these conflicts to the Court of Den Haag, and that doesn't seem to be legal. There doesn't seem to be a concrete, tangible solution via this way.
No,
Let's recollect. There was okay. The gentleman there. Yes.
Good afternoon, Professor Buruma. My name is Justin Paul from a graduate from Curtin University. The question I'd like to go and ask is with the People's Republic of China's own actions in the territorial dispute within, especially against both the Philippines as well as Vietnam. I'm not very certain whether can the PRC truly be as trustworthy as they will always purport them.
Yeah, well, no, I can't claim to have an answer where our leading politicians don't have an answer either on the territorial disputes. I think that what China is doing in Southeast Asia and East Asia is very similar to what Putin is trying to do in Central Europe and even in the Baltic states, which is he's trying to push as far as he can to test the US and its allies, and the question is how far will you let him push and what do you do about it? Now, the first questions about business integration and so on are one thing that make the solution a bit more difficult in a way, because when the EU has to come up with a policy towards Russia testing its power in the Baltic states, in Ukraine and so on, business interests, of course, are a very major factor in staying the hand of those who would seek any kind of tough response, including the threat of military conflict with Russia. And I think the same is true in Southeast and East Asia. I suppose that the easy cop-out answer would be that the West and the US and its allies, both in Europe and in Asia, have to make it very clear what the red line is. And I know red line is being given a bad name by Obama, but you have to sort of make it clear to China and Russia you can go so far but not further. In the case of Europe, that's easier to do in a way, because you could argue that whatever Russia does in the Ukraine or the Crimea, there's very little chance of the West taking any kind of military action to stop them. But if Russia were to invade a NATO member, the West really would have to respond in some kind of military fashion. The red line in Asia is perhaps slightly harder to draw, but there has to be one, and China has to know how far it can go before it really has military consequences. That's the only answer I can give, but I have no practical tips for any government to respond to this.
Professor Chu, and then the gentleman.
Well, there was another question. No, we're past it. Yeah.
And the gentleman.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much. Just 2 points that I'd like to discuss with you. First of all, you mentioned you globally career started off from China study. You must know China very well. I think in the past more than 60 years, we had the two Chinas. Mao's China is a revolutionary China. So when Mao said he is thankful to Tanaka-san for some sort of Japan's invasion, I think that kind of Mao's China is very ideological, because he perceives some sort of the water revolution to the China national interest. So if you take his words very seriously, I think it's some sort of misleading, because it's some sort of a Jew. Then he also believed the Japanese people was also victimized so much by the Japanese imperialist government. So then I don't think that could be evidence to show how Mao's China to look at the territorial disputes or something like that. Then we'll see another China is Deng's China. It's a nationalist and reformist China. So one of the leading sources of the China's surging nationalism is not just parties, some sort of with addition to the elusive ruling legitimacy, but is also wake up of China's national consciousness. My generation of the Chinese scholars getting into university in 80s. So then I very vividly memorized for them also some sort of historical whitewashing matter, really pissed off the Chinese young students. It's just because reformer opened that, get the Chinese young generation to recognize they should have a strong nationalist sense of the pride. So then even so far, I think the one of the leading parts of the China's nationalism is still some sort of a surging national pride. The same interesting parallel is from Korea. Korea is democratic. No need to fear some sort of nationalism for illusion of legitimacy. But why the Chinese and the Koreans equally, let's say, strong in some sort of such a, let's say, resentment vis-a-vis such a historical whitewashing rhetoric? I think it's also a very, very interesting demonstration of such a, let's say, equally mounting national sense of pride and something like that. Then second point is this. You, in your conclusion, you also mentioned, so maybe US is still functioning well to stabilize the region. I think quite a few people will be doubt that. So even from my personal views, I think US is security anchor. So no one can just get to the US out. Even for Chinese, US is indispensable part, but never estimated some sort of Asian Western. For example, Chinese-Japanese relations in the past 2,000 years, but only just got into a very limited time of such a troubled relations. But most of the time of our relationship, we got around well with each other. We also just feeding very, very positively, culturally and economically to each other. So then, my question is, if the Americans' liability in Asian security order is always based on some sort of such a dictum, we say, either Japan goes nuclear or then the US will go home. My view is that even if Japan goes nuclear, it's not bad news for Chinese. I really see that kind of a Japan with more confident and probably more comfortable about the new power relations with China. Then on the other hand, we also see today America's hegemonic stability in East Asia has never been in bad shape. The reason is Japan's unleashed. But the problem is how such an unleashed Japan can also just, simultaneously mitigate the concern from Chinese Koreans. Then another question also coming. Now US is overplayed the power game between Tokyo and Beijing. So then we also see Beijing feel very unsatisfied. I don't think that even you mentioned some nationalistic conservative Japanese also will feel unsatisfied. So then now I think the leading challenge for America's security role in the region is how to keep China and Japan simultaneously in place. We need some sort of new thinking, new approach.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. Behind that.
My name is Yong-Wook Liu from the Australian National University. Thank you so much for your great presentation, especially highlighting domestic politics of the issue. I do have slightly different perspective on the issue, and actually differ even more substantially from your arguments regarding the politics behind the issue, but maybe this is not the occasion to give my own lecture. Let me just ask you one question. So if the domestic politics is really the main reason driving the salience of these historical issues, and if there are political gains to be had by different domestic political actors, it's quite puzzling to me why we're not seeing greater usage being made of these historical issues by these different political actors. Why isn't the case that we don't hear too much of the history, so-called history problem? Why is it the case that these regional countries are trying to get together and cooperate on other issues when there are political gains to be had by these key actors? Thank you.
One more. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. My name is Tan Sak from the ASEAN Study Center. The 2014 survey of the Institute of International Education came out today, and it showed that from mainland China, there are 274,000 students studying in USA. So as an educator, do you see any hope or any potential for this large number of US educated Chinese students returning home to help address some of the historical problems?
Since I think that will be the last question, yeah, and then you get the chance to respond to this.
Tomo Kikuchi, Center on Asia and Globalization, Econ School of Public Policy. Since we started drawing comparison between Germany and Japan, I just want to ask one question where I see parallel. In Germany, we had national socialism, and in Japan, we had national Shintoism. Big difference is that Hitler took his own life, whereas the emperor in Japan survived the war. My question is, what is your view on the Japanese emperor as a symbol of nation, and what the impact of that on the issues that you addressed? Thank you.
If I were to answer all these questions adequately, we'd be here tomorrow morning. Now, let's see. National consciousness. I'm a bit suspicious of reading too much in national consciousness because it's a little bit like the feelings of the people. Whose consciousness are we talking about in the first place? Because nations are, people have very different consciousness or ideas or views or emotions about things depending on who they are, their class, and so on and so forth, inside a nation. Also, national consciousness changes. It's a bit like another term which is often bandied about, ancient hatreds. The Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims have always had ancient hatreds, and that explains the war, the atrocities in Bosnia. It doesn't explain anything. It's like the ancient hatreds between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. People who've been living together perfectly peacefully and amicably can, under particular circumstances, politically manipulated, suddenly become extremely violent. It's a very unpleasant comment on human nature, but that's the way it is. Now, I don't think that these hatreds are ancient necessarily, unchanging, or like a volcano always there to burst out. It's almost always, that was the point really that I was trying to get across. I think it's almost always politically manipulated, which is not to say that there is no real emotion behind it. Yeah, no, well, we disagree about that, but I mean, you asked me to answer your question. That's my view. I think it's almost always politically motivated, which is not to say that there's nothing there to manipulate. Of course there is. But when the Prime Minister of India says that his idea of Hinduism is the true Indian consciousness, which is finally coming out and that had always been there, this is political propaganda, and nothing more or less, in my view. Political gains of using history, it depends a bit on who is gaining by it. The people who use history for political reasons in Japan, for example, conservatives, they think they're gaining. That doesn't mean to say every Japanese businessman is going to be talking about history in the same way, or even every Japanese. I mean, there are certain factions in every country that use history for particular political reasons, which is not to say that everybody in that country will use them. And so there are specific political gains that specific people will seek to achieve by the use of history. So again, the Serbian example, when the propagandists of the anti-Muslim war in Bosnia would quote the medieval battle against the Ottoman Empire, they thought that they were getting political gain out of that. But that doesn't mean to say that every Serb would think that way. So you'd have to look very carefully who's saying what for what reasons. So again, it's coming back to this national consciousness. I mean, you have to look very carefully at the person who's using that kind of rhetoric and why they're using it. What was the other one? Oh, the most interesting question, the large number of Chinese students in the US. Now, it's a fascinating question, actually. One good thing is that they're saving the tradition of Western classical music. Where I teach, they have a very good conservatory. And a third of the classical music students at Bar College, where I teach, are Chinese. And there are probably more pianists and violinists and so on playing Western classical music in China now than anywhere else in the world. So this is undoubtedly a good thing. Will it serve the purpose of peaceful relations and so on? Maybe, maybe not. It's, of course, always a good thing, which is why I would always encourage students to study abroad. It opens minds and so on. You can also close them. People go abroad, they feel unappreciated, they have trouble with a landlord or something, they see this as racism, they go back to their own country, they get positions of some authority, and all their resentments about the way they were treated abroad come out, and they become ultra-nationalist. It's very interesting if you look at his personal history of most of the ultra-nationalists in Japan after the war, the kind of people who talk about China and America being the enemy and Japan having fought an honorable war of liberation and so on. If you look at their personal history, very, very often they're people who studied French literature, English literature, German history or something. Some of them would go abroad, come back with bad experiences, and suddenly become ultra-nationalists. It's a fairly common pattern. Now, I'm not saying that this is the dominant strain, so I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but one has to be a little skeptical about the notion of foreign exchange, foreign students, and so on. This will inevitably serve peace. I mean, it'll serve many things, not necessarily always peace. National Shintoism and National Socialism, I'm not sure these are the same things. And I'm convinced that the Japanese emperor, whatever his faults, I mean, the late Japanese emperor, he was no Hitler. Talk about charisma. He had very little. And certainly had never had the power, the actual power. How much power, authority he actually had is still a matter of dispute. We don't really know. But he was very much a symbol of something that was being used by all kinds of people, again, for their own political reasons. But he really was no Hitler, so I don't think that the difference is that he lived and Hitler died. I don't think that explains post-war developments in either country.
Thank you. Well, I think